How's everybody today? Can you hear me? Is this okay? All right, one sec. Are we good? All right. Okay, today's sermon is called Take Time to Live, Coram Deo, and I'm assuming most people don't know what that means. My prayer is that by the end of this that you'll understand what that means. But I enjoy being here. I love this church. It's a beautiful church. And that's great. I appreciated hearing Brother Teddy's testimony. I think there's nothing more powerful than our testimonies, where God is leading us, where we were, and where we are today. And God is so gracious, so I really appreciated that. So what is one of the most important things we have in this world? And the answer to me is time. Time. I think sometimes we forget that we have a certain amount of time on this earth. I have Sirius radio account, and I listen to sometimes this lady, and she's like a psychologist, and she'll always say, she'll say a phrase. She'll say, between now and dead, are you okay with keep doing the same thing in your life? And I always think about that. It's like between now and dead, we all have a certain amount of time between now and, unless Jesus comes back before then, of course. But I'm saying our time is limited. And sometimes we forget about that. We kind of go through life, and it's not always the easiest thing to think about. But that's what I want to talk about today. And really, how should we relate to time? What should we be doing with our time? Okay, this comes from, if anybody's heard of Charles Swindoll, he was a preacher down in Texas, and he had a radio show. And I read this book. It was called The Finishing Touch. And he says there's 5 sure things you can do to waste your time. And he was kind of playing devil's advocate, where he was saying, here, this is the thing that is going to waste your time, to kind of get us thinking about what this is about. And the first thing he said was, worry a lot. He says, start to worry early in the morning and then intensify your anxiety as the day goes along. Number 2, make hard and fast predictions. I think a lot of us do this. We think we know what's going to happen, and a lot of times we don't. Things work out differently than we plan. In his book, he talks about, has anyone heard of Jimmy Hoffa? He was the union, or the Teamster guy. It got me thinking. I grew up in West Bloomfield, and his last appearance was right on Telegraph Road. It was a place called the Macus Red Fox. And I always drive by there, and it's an Andiamo today, but I always think it's interesting to think about, he didn't know what was going on. But there's a quote, a month before he disappeared, they said, there's a lot of talk about danger in your life. He said, I don't need a bodyguard. I'm fine. There's no problems, right? And then a month later, he disappeared and was never heard from again. So again, we make hard and fast predictions. It's good to be flexible. 3, fix your attention on getting rich. It's an older book, so it's a little bit dated, but it says go to secular bookshelves to get innovative ideas to get rich. Also go to entrepreneurial seminars and take a lot of meetings on how to do good sales pitches. Okay. Compare yourself with others is number 4. So he said if you're into fitness, if you compare yourself to Arnold Schwarzenegger or Jane Fonda, that will really keep you busy. And I think this one's, it's an easy thing for people to do, I think, but we don't want to compare ourselves with others. We want to try to look inward, see ourselves, and be the best version of ourselves, I believe. Number 5, this is my favorite. lengthen your lists of enemies. He says, if there's one thing above all others to waste time, then it's perfecting the skill at the blame game. And he says, if you do these 5 things, you're destined to waste a lot of valuable time. So my prayer is we don't do that. We don't want to waste valuable time. We want to make good use of our time, don't we? I know this is not a great picture. Well, you can kind of see it. I had the honor, my son had a field trip down to Washington, D.C. this past spring. It was a wonderful trip, and one of the places we went to is the Arlington Cemetery in Virginia, and that's where they bury people who have had really military backgrounds. But I really loved the trip, but that was probably my highlight. Because one thing, and I know this might sound strange, but one of my favorite things to do is to go to cemeteries and walk around and just meander and take my time. Especially if I know somebody, I like to give, just have a remembrance in my mind of them. But I walk around cemeteries and I get to thinking a lot about each person, each headstone. That was a person who had a story, who lived a life and did something. And it just gets me, thinking about that. It helps me to put my life in perspective. One thing I've noticed, every time I leave a cemetery, I feel grateful to be alive. If that sounds, I don't know if that's strange, but that's just how I feel. Because I said, I'm still breathing, I'm above ground, and I'm thankful for that. I've had a lot of friends who are not here today anymore for one reason or another. So I do like going to cemeteries. And when I was at the Arlington Cemetery, there was a lot of neat things to see. There was the tomb of the unknown soldier, and I saw the changing of the guards, and then JFK, the Eternal Flame Memorial, and I don't know if people know, but Robert E. Lee, who was a Confederate general, his house was there, and he had to evacuate it before the Civil War. But his house is still there, and we got to visit that. But if you look, I don't know if you can see, one of the most touching moments was we went to this grave site, and his name was Ian Thomas Zook, Z-O-O-K. And he was born in 1980 and died in 2004 in the Iraq War. And he was only 24 years old. And again, it just gives you perspective. I'm very thankful for those that, we take our freedom for granted sometimes, and I'm thankful for those sacrifices that people do, the ultimate sacrifice. But it was very emotional, and to think about his life, and one of the kids read off the story of his life, and we videotaped it, gave it to his parents, and laid a wreath at his tomb. But again, I bring this up because I want to just get us thinking about our time here on earth. It's limited. So where I want to go today is talk about time and our relationship to time. And so where do you think, this is probably a really easy answer for you guys, where should we go? What's the best place to go if we want to learn about time and our relationship to time and what we should be doing with our time? What do you think? The Bible, okay, easy with that picture and everything. But yes, the Bible. So we're going to be spending time in the Bible today, just kind of flipping around. So if you have it, please have it out. We're going to start in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3. Ecclesiastes, chapter 3. And if you don't, we'll read some of these. And Ecclesiastes is one of those books that I really like, along with James, the book of James. I believe they're very practical. If you want practical advice for your life, it gives you a good biblical worldview for practical living. So let's start with, I want to read chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. And some people, this is a poem. This is actually a poem. And some people have said this is the most beautiful poem ever written. Some of you may recognize this. It was an old song from the 60s, so it may sound familiar to you. But I'm gonna read this. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, starting at verse 1. It says, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to get and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend or tear apart and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace." Okay, so I'm not gonna, I could dig into that, but we're not gonna dig deep into what's going on there. But a lot of this is, it's a compare and contrast of 14 pairs of opposites. And it's a very profound poem, I would say. But the main theme is about time. So the preacher here, which many believe to be Solomon, is talking about time. So let's talk a little bit about time before we move forward. Does anybody know what time is? What is time? And it's really not an easy answer when you start thinking about it. We think about time, we think about our watches, our cell phones, but what is actually time? And but time is something that fascinates people. If you think about TV shows and movies, people are fascinated with the idea of time travel, right? What would it be like to go back in time and see my parents at the same age as me, or to go into the future and to see how things turn out with me, or whatever it might be. But I think it's a very fascinating topic. A few summers ago, I read a book by Benjamin Franklin, and it was the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. And his quote was, "Do not squander time, for that is the stuff life is made of." He's also the one that said time is money. So I guess that's one definition. We could say time is money. But I would argue that time is much more valuable than money. It's the most valuable commodity there is. What's more valuable? Would you rather have more time or have a bit more money? I mean, it's really an easy thing if you think about it. But the cool thing about it is, if time is the most valuable thing there is, commodity-wise, each person on this planet is equally rich, right? So it's just a matter of how do we use that time wisely? Because each one of us gets 24 hours in a day, 168 hours in a week, right? So, and it's one of those commodities that you can't get back. So you could lose money, you could even lose health, and there's ways of getting money back, or there's ways of regaining your health, right? But time, once you lose it, unless something gets invented, like a time machine, that's gone, right? That time is gone, which I don't think there will be, but anyhow, so far, we still have not answered this question: what is time? What is time? So we could go to science, and all you're going to get is question marks. It's one of the, like, if you go into physics, if you go into any physics textbook, it's a mystery. I mean, physics is about, like, matter and motion through time, right? Through space and time. But if you really dig down deep, they have no answer of what time actually is. It's just, they use time, but they don't know what it is. And even, I won't get into much of this, but calculus is like is the math they use for physics. And again, you won't find the answers there either. But again, what I want to say, I guess, for today is we don't know exactly what time is. It's kind of a mystery. But for our purposes today, it's not that important, because what we really want to do is say, how do we relate to time in a wise, good way? And how do we have a biblical worldview when it comes to time? So I want to go back to the book of Ecclesiastes, to what we said. Again, the writer he recognizes himself as the preacher, which most people believe is to be Solomon. I do too. And there's something more going on in that poem that we read, in verses 1 through 8. He's actually struggling with time. He's saying that we have no control over it. And I think maybe you've felt that way too. As I get older, the time just flies. I mean, a year is just nothing now. It's hard to even explain. When I was younger, I felt like it moved a little slower. As I get older, a year is just like, almost feels like a day sometimes, and it's amazing to me. And so Solomon here, he's saying, it's a beautiful poem, but when you really dig down deep, what he's trying to say too is that time is oppressive and maybe even unfair. So when you read the book of Ecclesiastes, you have to be a little bit careful, because you can't take everything at face value. You have to kind of read it in context, because he's saying, a lot of the book is being written in a form of saying, okay, what if God doesn't exist? What if, because ultimately life is meaningless without God. And he's kind of showing that. And through his life experiences, he realizes that life is meaningless without God, because he was close with God, and then he started living his life away from God. And so we could really learn a lot, that here's a man who had everything you could possibly want, world-wise. He had everything you could get from the world, and he was broken and unhappy, and he didn't find any meaning and purpose or value in that life. So when you read it, you have to kind of look through that lens. Some of what he's saying is through the lens of, okay, life is meaningless, but then at other times he kind of switches to, this is what life is with God. So you just have to be a little careful there. But going back to this, he's saying time is oppressive, time is unfair. So he's really putting a problem out on the table here. And I was going to ask, does anybody ever wish they had a remote control for their life? I've thought about that, and I know I'm just kind of going through my thoughts here, but I would love it if I could rewind, fast forward, pause. Just give me a pause. But it doesn't happen. You can't do anything. It just keeps going and going. And that's really what he's saying, is like we have no control over it, and it's almost like we're at time's mercy. So he's putting that on the table here. Hey, we have a problem. But the nice thing about it, when he puts a problem out there, he doesn't just leave it like that. He puts a solution. Problem, solution. Problem, solution. So let's look at that. Again, we go back to the Bible for that. So if you are still in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, I want to read verses 9 through 11. Verse 9 says, "What profit hath he that worketh in that wherein he labors? I have seen the travail which God has given to the sons of men to be exercised in it." Now here, this is an amazing verse here. "He has made everything beautiful in his time. Also, he has set the world in their heart, so that no man can find out the work that God makes from the beginning to the end." Verse 11 in Ecclesiastes 3, that has to be one of my all-time favorite verses. He says, God makes everything beautiful in his time. And I believe God does use beauty to get our attention and to draw himself closer to him. I can think of times in my life that I've watched a beautiful sunset, or I just looked at, did some bird watching, or I saw the northern lights, or I think God really tries to get at our hearts through beauty, and he does. We live in a fallen world, so sometimes it's harder to see it, but there is still an amazing amount of beauty in the world, and we just have to be looking out for it. And the more we are attuned to that and see that beauty, I think it can draw us closer to God than almost just about anything. It really is a way. God makes many ways to draw closer to him. But now it says, he has set the world in their heart. He has set the world in their heart. But if you read different, I'm reading the King James, but if you look in, say, the NIV or the New King James or some other versions, I think it's a better, they say eternity. You set eternity in our, so God has put eternity in our hearts. Our hearts are not going to be satisfied with things of the world. And Solomon realizes that. He has wives, he had money, he had power, he had everything, but none of that was fulfilling in his heart. There's something about us in our hearts with eternity that only God can fill. Only God can fill that eternity, that thing that we long for. And so, let's keep going here. Let's keep going. So now we're onto something, I feel like. And if you read through the book of Ecclesiastes, I feel like this is kind of a turning point verse where things are kind of negative, and now he's moving more into a positive framework. Verse 12 says, I know that there is no good in them, but for a man to rejoice and to do good in his life, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. So now here is the verse 14, which was read by Jennifer. Thank you for our scripture reading. I know that whatsoever God doeth, it shall be forever. Nothing can be put to it, nor anything taken from it. And God does it that men should fear before him. So now I feel like we're getting somewhere. God does these things that men should fear before him, If you could move with me now, let's go to Ecclesiastes chapter 12. I want to look at verses 13 to 14. Probably many of you are familiar with this, but this is at the very end of Ecclesiastes, and he's kind of summing everything up. So we're kind of fast-forwarding through a lot, but Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14. And so he says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. What I really want to focus on here is the very first thing. I don't think it's on purpose that the very first thing is talking about fear God. Fear God. So we have a problem. We have a problem with time. We don't know how to relate with time. And now I believe he's saying, fear God. That's something we should be doing with our time. There's a lot we could be doing with our time, but if we're not fearing God, if we're not cultivating that fear with God, that's the starting point. If we're not doing that, we're missing out. We're missing it. Here's a tweet. Timothy Keller, he's an author I really enjoy reading. He died, I think, last year. But he did this tweet a couple years ago, and I like this. He says, to fear the Lord biblically means to be in awe and wonder of his greatness and love. And so it's hard because our English language can be a little tricky, especially when it gets translated here, but there is different fears, and this fear is different. We're talking about being in the presence of the Lord, being present with God, being present with others. And I think that's a problem today. Being present is a problem. Being present with others, being present with God, it's a real problem. But why? Why is that a problem? I believe it's always been a problem, but I think it's more of a problem today than ever. And I'm going to put two main reasons why I think being present with God, having that presence of God, being present in general is a problem today. The first one here is a clock. A clock. So we haven't always, if you go into some history, you realize people have not always been ruled and run by a clock, which we are today. Everything is, we just have a clock, we have time, everything is about timing, right? We look at the day, the time, this is what I have to do, and you just kind of get through your day through the clock. But it wasn't always like that. Back in there was a time in history when it was more event-oriented. Today I got to go do this, I have to do this. But what I find interesting is back then the church was the place that kept time the most. And that's why you'd have church bells and you would do things like that. And the purpose of that time was to get people's attention to say, hey, it's time to worship God. It's a reminder. So time, I believe, was meant for a reminder to, hey, don't forget God in your day. And even in other Christian churches, they would think of time they would say Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Lent, Easter, and then they would call it ordinary time. So they'd walk through the year with a focus on those things. And I'm not going to go into detail on that, on if that's good or bad. I'm just saying, the main thing is that time and these chunks of time in church was to really get our minds on God, to help us with worship and not distract from it. Which I think today, it's the ironic thing is I think time is doing the opposite to us, where it's almost a distraction. Like we're just like, okay, let's just get through our day, and I'll just say right off the front, when I'm talking and going through this, I'm really talking to myself. I'm learning on this. I'm not saying it's hard. You're up here, I'm preaching this, but this is something I need probably more than anyone here. But nevertheless, I feel like this is what God put on my heart here. So we're driven by the clock. We're driven by time, dates, and we want to be as productive and efficient as possible. And I'm not saying that's bad. Because it is good to be productive. It's good to be efficient. We have to live in the society we live in. And so don't get me wrong. We have to be balanced. That's all. So that's the first thing I want to say is the clock and how we relate to the clock can be an issue, why we don't fear the God and we don't have the presence of God. And this is an easy one to pick on, and I don't want to pick on it, but the cell phone, right? Technology. I'll just say modern technology can be a thing. So you have the clock, you have modern technology, and I think we all see it. I'm not saying anything new or crazy here, but yeah, cell phones can be a distraction, right? Modern technology can be a distraction, especially from being present with God. Does that mean we get rid of our cell phones? I don't think so. We have to learn to deal with the times we live in. Make the best use. Make things useful for us, not let things kind of take over and just go with the flow of the culture or how things are. We have to be wiser than that, right? When I first started, I work at Ford Motor. I work with Val. I just had my 23-year anniversary there, and I was thinking back on my time when I first started. They gave me a little cubicle, and I had a desktop computer, and I would go there, and I would sit down, click, do my computer stuff, whatever. And at the end of the day, I'd go home. That was it. It was a very clear mark between this is my work, this is my home. And the strange thing about technology is that these things are supposedly made to make our lives better, more efficient, all this. But now that I have a work phone, a cell phone, and after COVID being home a little bit more, that it's kind of blurred now, right? You always have this thing, you're always on call. And it's hard because I feel like everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, a lot of times we feel like we're always on call. So where do we get that downtime? How do we navigate this? Because I remember just 20 years ago, it was different. I could leave work behind. I could go get some downtime. it's a different world we live in now, and we have to be realistic about that. And it made me think of washing machines too, right? I mean, they were made to be more efficient, and you can wash clothes. From what I understand, from what I read, is back in the day, doing laundry was like an all-day event. You would get all your clothes together, wash them, hang them up, get them outside, and it was just a big ordeal. Now you can just throw them in, an hour later you have them washed. The difference is that our expectations change. So we keep getting these technologies, thinking our lives are going to get better, but what happens is our expectations change in terms of what's expected of us. Now it's like our clothes have to be, you can wear them just like for an hour and then they got to be washed. So people are just washing all the time. So have you really saved time? Probably not. And with cell phones, I mean, to me it's pretty self-explanatory. They can be used for good things, but again, it depends how you use it. But a lot of times they can be a distraction. And I think sometimes it's almost a catch-22 because we're always on, we're never off the clock, and we want a distraction, a way to get away, so we go to the cell phone, the very thing that is still distracting us, right? So we have a problem here. And again, I'm not saying technology's bad, I'm not saying clocks are bad. I think we just have to be wise about how we use them. This is a Gutenberg press. So this was a technology back in the day. So again, this is nothing new. New things come around. And this was a great blessing because now instead of just writing down the Bible, you could mass produce Bibles, and it got the word out to many people, right? And so it was a blessing. At the same time, some really harmful things were printed out on these things, right? So again, it's nothing new. I'm not saying anything we're dealing with is new. We just have to deal with them. And now we live in a digital age. We just have to be smarter. Being fully present is difficult, but I believe God wants us to be more present, more aware of his presence throughout the day. Not just we come to church on Sabbath and we're aware of his presence a little bit. And even that, we see the clock and we go, okay, I got to get to church on time. And now we got this, now we got that. And I get it, you have to live by some kind of clock. But at the same time, we want to just be aware of God and his presence. And I believe the more present we are with God, the more present we can be with other people. Jesus said ultimately our purpose here on earth is to love God with all our hearts, love our neighbors as ourselves. Without being present, that's pretty much impossible. Coram Deo. I said I'd come to this. I'm finally here. Coram Deo. Does anybody know what that means? Okay. Coram Deo is a Latin phrase, and it actually means before the face of God. Deo is God. So the sermon title is Take Time to Live Coram Deo. We have this time. Live your life before the face of God. And that really means cultivate a fear of the Lord in our lives. And so what this does, it means it doesn't matter if you're at work, if you're home, you're at church, online, wherever you might be, we want to cultivate a fear of the Lord. We want to live Coram Deo before the face of God. And let's look real quick. Proverbs 1:7. I don't want to get too long on time here, but Proverbs 1:7 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." I don't want to go too much in this. I could go for a while on this, but throughout the Bible, it talks about, it compares the fool versus the wise people and the fools. And the Bible's not saying that fools are stupid. It doesn't mean they have low IQ. What it means is fools, and I could get into some verses on this, but I'm getting long on time, I think, that fools live their life as if God doesn't exist. They live life almost like an atheist, right? Just God doesn't exist. The problem with that is that I think sometimes we do that. People that are believers in God, we kind of go through life as if God doesn't exist. I'm not saying that as a harsh thing. I'm talking to myself here. To be wise, to be truly wise, is to live with an active sense of God's holy presence, good power, and wise provision in our lives. Proverbs 14:27 says, "The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, to depart from the snares of death." The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life. So what does that mean to not have the fear of the Lord? We're talking something pretty serious there. So we want to just, whatever we do, wherever we go, we want to have an idea of God's presence with us. And, I want to read this real quick. You don't have to turn there. I thought this was cool. Exodus 20:20. We're all aware of Exodus 20, where the Ten Commandments are. But Exodus 20:20. "And Moses said unto the people, Fear not, for God is come to prove you, and that his fear may be before your faces, that ye sin not." Which I think is cool, because fear is used twice here, and in two different ways. Moses says, "Fear not," like that's literal fear. Do not be afraid, for God has come to prove you, and that his fear, we're talking about that awareness, that love, that awe of God, may be before your faces. Coram Deo, right? And there's a lot of verses here about Coram Deo. One more I want to read here about that because I think this is important. Psalm 139. You can go there if you'd like. Psalm 139, 1 through 4. Psalm 139, 1 through 4. It says, "O Lord, thou hast searched me and know me. You know my downsitting and my uprising, my understanding, my thought afar off. You compass me, my path, and my lying down, and art acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word in my tongue, but lo, O Lord, thou knows it altogether." It describes it. It's like wherever we are, whatever we're doing, God is there. And, this is another thought I had. We want to live a life, Coram Deo, pleasing to God. We want to live a life pleasing to God, in the presence of God. And I was just thinking of social media and how I think sometimes we've turned into a society of wanting to maybe show others how good I am and how cool I am or whatever it might be. But really, we kind of, in Coram Deo, we want to live for an audience of one. We want to live a life that's pleasing to God, not that on social media, hey, I got it all together and, whatever. Our lives really should just be to glorify God, and the rest is details. I'm not saying you have to be off social media, but I guess what I'm trying to get at with all this is we got to get this right first. We got to live the life Coram Deo. We have to live in the fear of the Lord before the face of God, in the fear of God. And if that's not right, then we really miss the mark in a lot of ways. So please don't take me wrong. Social media is not bad. Cell phones aren't bad. Clocks aren't bad. Because you can be taken wrong. It's just a matter of being wise about that, not being foolish. And Jesus lived in the fear of the Lord, and he embodies that idea. And I like this picture. I think of him as a carpenter. Whatever he did, he lived before God. He lived that life. So now, I'm starting to wrap up. And with all that said, how, practically speaking, do we cultivate? So I wanted to put down a few ideas on how do we cultivate a fear of the Lord? How do we live a life Coram Deo? Proverbs 8:13 says, "The fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride, and arrogancy, and the evil way and the perverse mouth do I hate." A simple prayer that I've heard is, Lord, help me to love that what you love and hate what you hate. That could be a simple prayer. That's a great way to start your day. Lord, the fear of the Lord is to hate these things that God hates. Help me, Lord, to hate those things that you hate and love the things you love. So that's I think a good first step. Psalm 89:15. I'm giving 3 steps. This is step number 2. So first is to say, God, help me to not love these things that are bad. Psalm 89:15 says, "Blessed is the people that know the joyful sound. They shall walk, O Lord, in the light of thy countenance." Right? Before the face of God. And I think just throughout your day, I think sometimes we always think, oh, if I'm going to pray, I got to make this long 1-hour prayer and it's got to be just perfectly said. I think throughout our day, we can do short little prayers and just to kind of keep God's presence in our mind. God, I love you. God, thank you for that. I see something beautiful. Oh, it's beautiful, Lord. Thank you. So I just think that's a simple way too. It's just throughout your day, just pray. Even if something bad happens to you, Lord, thank you for that because you're going to make it for your good and I'm going to learn from it. So, and third, Psalm 95:6. O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. So worship. In your car, if you have time, sing a song to God. Obviously, read our Bibles and pray. Those are usually the go-tos, and they're wonderful. Find time to do that. Really find something. If God's leading you to read something, to learn something, pray, and sing songs to God. Even if you're somewhere where you can't sing out loud, maybe listen to a song on the radio that honors Christ and keep that song in your heart throughout your day. Maybe even memorize some scripture in your mind, right? There's a lot of wonderful ways to do that. Okay, so in conclusion, our time on earth is limited. None of us know how much time we have left. The good news, and I hope none of this was depressing, because I realize that may not have come through. It doesn't matter your age. It doesn't matter what you've done in life. It doesn't matter any of that, because each one of us is here right now. And we don't have to live in regret. Christ has taken all that away from us. We're followers of Christ. We don't have to live in all that. We can live in joy, happiness, and the good news is that right now, each one of us, maybe all we have is today. I don't know if I have tomorrow. I don't know that. But I could start today. I could start to maybe live before God, in the fear of God, more today than I did yesterday. I think that's a good start, right? So hopefully that came across. I don't know if it did, but it's good news, okay? There's hope. And with Christ, there's always hope, right? And so that's how I want to end that right there. So I just pray that God would give us the grace and courage to live more fully in his presence. So, amen.